Cool. Okay. If everyone's ready, I have 7 minutes. My name is Caroline Martin, and I'll be the first speaker from Gov for Los Altos. All right, my time starts now. We strongly affirm the resolution that the United States federal government should substantially increase investment into hydroelectric power. We define this to be a policy round, which means that we're going to be weighing it on net benefits. And our plan is that the US federal government will substantially increase research and development in wave energy in coastal areas. All right, the actor is going to be the US federal government. The funding is going to be normal ways and means. The time frame is as soon as possible. And the method of implementation is also normal ways and means. All right, just for some definitions and background, basically one is hydroelectric power. Hydroelectric power is any renewable energy that uses the natural flow of moving water to generate electricity. And wave energy is a specific type of hydroelectric power that uses energy from the motion of waves. It basically has buoys on the water with a cord that ties it to offshore generators. And in the offshore generators, that is where the actual energy is produced. And that's just a more specific type of hydroelectric power. So advantage one is that hydroelectric power is good. Uniqueness point one is that it's much more efficient than other types of electricity. We see that hydroelectric power is actually up to 90% efficient in converting water into electricity, and specifically wave energy is extremely efficient. You can see that just taking the waves around the coast of the US, 2.64 trillion kilowatt hours of electricity per year could potentially be generated, and that would be 64% of the total electricity generation in the US electricity consumption in the US in 2021. What we see is that other forms of energy, solar is only 30 to 36% efficient, wind power is only 25 to 45%, and coal power is only 33 to 40% efficient. So clearly, hydroelectric power is far more efficient than many of these other options. Second is that wave energy is uniquely good. We see that wave energy technology contributes zero emissions right now, and wave energy generation is very promising. The power density is approximately 30 kilowatt to 40 kilowatts per meter of a wave along the shore, and this increases to 100 kilowatts further into the ocean, and this is 20 to 60 times more energy dense compared to other forms of renewable energy, which is what makes it so efficient. We also see that since waves are predictable, we can get consistent energy generation, and it doesn't have to slow down for a lot of maintenance. It's just literally just buoys floating in the ocean that are harnessing the power of the waves that connect to generators. So there's not much maintenance required there, not as much at least as other forms of electricity. Third is that research and development is key. We see that right now only 6 wave energy projects exist in the US, and less than 1% of energy generation right now is wave power. However, investment can change this. The theoretical annual energy potential of waves off the coast, again, is estimated to be about 64% of total US energy generation from 2021. Fourth, the alternative is fossil fuels. Basically, we see that in 2022, about 60% of US energy was from fossil fuels, and right now, hydroelectric power is only 6.3% of the US's energy. We also see that the US uses 16% of the world's energy right now and is the second largest energy user globally. So links. Basically, how does the plan help with this? Well, wave power development is extremely important. We see that with expanded development, wave power will become utilized more often along coastal regions, and clean energy generation through this increases substantially. We also see the expanded research. Research will be utilized to make wave energy better, more efficient, and better for the environment as well. We also see cleaner energy generation. Ultimately, as a result of this, we gain cleaner energy and can better help the transition away from fossil fuels. All right, internal links. One is that this decreases reliance on fossil fuels. Basically, if we're investing in something that could generate 64% of the total US electricity from 2021, will massively decrease reliance on fossil fuels. Second is signaling. We see that if the US is increasing investment into hydroelectric wave energy, other countries will also be incentivized to do the same, because the US is a key country that has a lot of influence, which basically just scales up the impacts of this renewable energy even more across the globe. We also see that foreign development is key. Wave energy globally has the potential to satisfy 20 to 30% of global energy demand, which is a really large, it's a really substantial amount. All right. On to impacts. Basically, why does any of this matter? Well, first is the environment. We see that the environment is really bad right now. We've had a 2.05 degrees Fahrenheit increase since the late 19th century, and most of the warming occurred in the past 40 years, with the 6 warmest years on record taking place since 2014. And basically, what all of this means is that we need to act now. Basically, according to scientists, in 7 years, the damage done to our climate by climate change to environments will be irreversible. And in 5 years, climate change will be responsible for some dead animals. Basically, animals will be taken out of the food chain, which disrupts ecosystems. And 1 million species of animals and plants will face extinction due to climate change. Here is that glaciers are melting. We see that there are rising sea levels and ocean temperatures are rising. People will be displaced because of this along like coastal areas. E is that there's going to be increased insect outbreaks that where more insects will be like spreading disease, which ends up killing a lot of people. And basically, we see that the plan solves because again, you can just extend how 64% of the US's total energy generation could potentially be replaced with clean, renewable wave energy, and 20 to 30% of the global energy demand could be satisfied through this. And this would be a massive shift to cleaner energy that would help like make a massive step in offsetting global warming. So at the end of the day, we can see that increasing investment and like research and development in wave energy will be extremely beneficial because again, it like shifts us away from fossil fuels and it's just a really good form of energy that's really useful, really renewable and good for the environment. Yeah.
So your plan is only about like offshore wave energy and it's not about just hydroelectric power as a whole?
No, it's like specifically wave energy, which is like a subset of hydroelectric. All right. With that, my time ends. So I urge a strong affirmative ballot.
Okay. I'm Emily. I'm the first Gov speaker. Sorry, just looking at my. Okay. Okay, my time starts now. We strongly oppose the following resolution that the United States federal government should substantially increase investment in hydroelectric power. This is a policy round, thus affirmative burden is to propose a model that adequately addresses the resolution, and they need to provide a means of significantly increasing this funding for the technology. As a negation, our burden is to prove to you that this policy lacks solvency or creates unique harms. Our criterion today, we agree it will be net benefit, essentially weighing on whether the Gov plan is beneficial and the impacts it has, but also taking into consideration the time frame in terms of when these impacts will happen in relation to its cost. So for topicality, the expectation is that it's supposed to include all forms of hydroelectric power in today's debate. You can include offshore wave energy, but you can't remove the typical form of hydroelectric power found in dams. The affirmative violates this topicality because, as per the resolution, the affirmative burden is to fully affirm the resolution itself, and the wording of the resolution indicates that the United States federal government should increase investment in hydroelectric power, not wave power. So they can't just only access the impacts of wave and coastal power, they also have to access the harms of just hydroelectric power in general. So I will get onto case, and with the remaining time that I have left, I will get into refutes to the opponent's case. So contention one is just the overall impact of these reservoirs. Not only do reservoirs harm the environment in which they are placed in, but in certain environments, they can be ineffective. So let's just look to this idea of environmental harms. Hydropower could cause more problems for the climate than it prevents. Hydro plants need large reservoirs to provide a steady stream of water. When these reservoirs are built, plants and other organic matter get flooded. This material decays over time, releasing greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide and methane. Reservoirs drastically change the landscape and the rivers that they are built on. Dams and reservoirs can reduce water flows, raise water temperature, degrade water quality, and cause sediment to build up. This has negative impacts on fish, birds, and other wildlife. Extend this to ocean energy. Creating infrastructure in the ocean increases waste, harms biodiversity, and destroys ocean ecosystems. But again, you could turn back to our argument on topicality that as the affirmative, they also have to access the harms of just overall hydroelectric power generation. So when we're looking at this idea of environmental harms, we can see that by implementing this plan, by implementing these hydroelectric dams, by implementing these wave coastal things, all of these create harms because we get these emissions from carbon dioxide and methane is a way more potent greenhouse gas than a lot of others, and this methane is actually going to be contributing to emissions and not really solving for climate change. Thus the affirmative doesn't really access the impacts that they would like you to believe. Then let's look to this idea of reliability, which directly clashes with one of their points on reliability. Hydroelectric dams generate power by releasing reservoir water through turbines. During a drought with less rain and snowfall, less water flows into reservoirs. With low reservoir levels and less water to release, hydroelectric power production declines. This also applies to their argument on wave energy. They like to tell you that it's reliable because waves always exist. But hydroelectric power plants in the ocean aren't necessarily just like you can place it anywhere and the waves are going to be turning it and generating energy. These need to be placed in very specific locations. The waves need to be powerful, and waves are also unpredictable because at certain times you're going to have low water levels. At certain times you're going to have less powerful waves, and this isn't necessarily reliable either. So you can't really buy their point. They can't access their impacts on reliability because either way, whether it's a hydroelectric dam or if it's on a coast, those waves are not predictable. In the first 3 years of California's current residents of the state have faced a $1.4 billion in costs due to the shortfall in hydroelectricity generation and an associated increase in greenhouse gas emissions as natural gas power plants have taken up most of the slack. Why increase reliance on an energy source that might not be continuously reliable and whose reliability will only continue to decline with climate change? We need to look to this idea of droughts because of these droughts, even if you spend all this money, billions of dollars, pouring all of that into these hydroelectric dams, into these powers, it's not really reliable and it's not sustainable either, because when there's droughts, all there is more cost in order to repair the dams, to take care of the dams, to maintain it, whereas while you're not going to be receiving any energy from it. In the short term, there are significant harms that outweigh the benefits, and in the long term, any benefits that we do see may cease to exist in the affirmative world. Hydroelectric power won't solve climate change, and we should favor an energy source that can be reliable despite inevitable changes to the climate. Contention 2 is on mangroves and offshore energy. So they would like to tell you about how, they want to put these things on the coast. We put it into coastal areas. However, one really important thing is that in these coastal areas, for example, we'll use California as an example. California has a large supply of mangroves. Mangroves are basically like wetlands on the coast. These mangroves absorb storms. These mangroves provide like water filtration. They prevent erosion on the coastal areas. They protect towns. They also are a huge carbon sink. Mangroves around the world are extremely important for carbon capture, and mangroves are, like, in addition to the ocean, one of the largest areas that we have that actually capture this technology. Now, the affirmative plan requires the deforesting of these mangrove forests, because when you're putting these wave energy turbines in these areas, we're going to be causing habitat destruction, and we're going to be destroying all of the mangroves. So next contention is just on rare earth elements. So we need to also look to the fact that the affirmative plan is not renewable. Hydroelectricity in and of itself is renewable, but the materials that are needed to generate this are not. For like the electricity generators that like turn the kinetic energy into potential energy that we can use, all of that requires the use of rare earth elements, and rare earth elements are not a renewable source. There's a limited supply of them, and at the rate we would consume rare earth elements, there are only 130 million metric tons left on our planet, and we are currently using 1 million annually, with that number only growing in the affirmative world. So whereas their plan could be considered green, it's not really renewable or sustainable. In addition to that, only 3% of reservoirs in the US are equipped to produce hydropower, and others are limited due to water storage and flood protection duties. So why pour money again into something that's not going to be sustainable, something that's not going to last long term, and something that's going to cause harms? We also need to look at this idea of carbon usage. In order to build these plants, it also takes energy. And according to a study from The Guardian, methane, which is at least 34 times more potent than other greenhouse gases, makes up 80% of emissions from water storage reservoirs created by dams. The Guardian also reports a study showing that the world's hydroelectric dams are responsible for as much methane emissions as Canada. Next, let's look to the cost of these raw materials. So, as we were saying before, REEs are mined, rare earth elements. And when they're mined, it forms chemical erosion and it leaches into ponds, and all of these toxic chemicals can leach into the groundwater, and it'll affect entire waterways and get rid of water resources for communities around it. For example, in China, there's an emergence of these areas called cancer villages where people are disproportionately more likely to get cancer or other types of diseases because of these minings. We just can't ignore the ethical concerns of this. Worker safety is also not prioritized. It results in skin irritation and disruptions to the respiratory, nervous, and cardiovascular systems. This mining is also causing habitat destruction and fragmentation. And for every 1 ton of rare earth, 2,000 tons of toxic waste are produced. So with just like the remaining time I have left, we can just look briefly over the affirmative case. We need to look to the fact that we responded to how it is unpredictable, it's not reliable, it's not actually going to lead to any long-term impacts, and their coastal impacts are also that they're going to be getting rid of mangrove forests, and for all these reasons, we strongly oppose.
Okay, cool. MG time. Let me just get out a timer. Order for this speech is probably just going to be top of case, AF neg. And then I'll just have T on top of case because I float it basically like a stock issue. All right. So again, specific order will be, I guess, just T, AF, neg in order. My name is Ethan Park. I'll be the second speaker for the AF, and my time will start on my next word. First on T, the overview to topicality is that nowhere in the resolution does it say all hydroelectric power. The resolution is specific to substantially increasing investment in hydroelectric power, and we are substantially increasing investment in hydroelectric power by like increasing investment into this specific type of hydroelectric power. Extend our conceded definition of hydroelectric power. This shows you that wave power is hydroelectric power. And again, substantially increasing investment in that is also substantially increasing investment in hydropower. The underview on T is that there's no implication to this argument. My opponents don't tell you to drop us for running our plan. They don't even tell you to drop our argument. They fundamentally can't force us to defend like their own idea of a plan text. The burden of the negative is to negate the affirmative plan, not to invent their own plan text to negate. They might come up here and try to say that they're like negating the resolution, but again, the resolution doesn't say all forms of hydroelectric power. It just says hydroelectric power in general. We are allowed to parametricize this down to like wave energy, because again, wave energy is hydro energy. They can also still run generic links to hydro bad on wave power, since we still utilize water to generate electricity. This is still like hydroelectric generation. They just don't do this. We aren't precluding any links to their disads though. They literally read mangroves as a very specific disad to coastal areas, which isn't like the dams that they were talking about initially, which shows that they were prepared for coastal generation. They were prepared for wave energy, and there's obviously no impact to T here. Again, the res never said dams, and it's not our burden to defend them. Okay, on to the first AF, or I guess the only AF. The overview to the hydroelectric power good contention that we read to you is that most of it goes conceded, and this is basically just going to be extensions. But first, let's go through the line by line. My opponents essentially say that like it's considered green energy, like the wave power that we talk about, but it's not renewable because it constrains like resources and it leads to like increased emissions. This fundamentally isn't true. Let's go through why. The first thing that my opponents talk about is methane. They say that methane generation happens as a result of dams, but again, we're not defending dams, we're defending buoys in the ocean. These don't create like the actual issues of methane, because like I guess I should just give a rundown of like what the technology is. There's like a buoy in the ocean. It is tied to a little cord, and when the wave like shakes the buoy, the cord also shakes, which means like there is then I forgot, there's like kinetic energy there, which is then transferred into like electrical energy by like generators. This doesn't create any methane. This is literally like, you know, those like bicycles where you pedal it and you get electricity as a result. It's literally that, but on a scale that's powered by waves. There is no methane generation as a result of this plan. And again, they can't force us to defend dams if we don't want to. On the point about how like there's like China cancer areas because of minings, and mining is bad and rare earth mining is bad. This is fundamentally non-unique at the point where literally all forms of energy generation use RAEs. I'll get to this on the neg when I get there, but like at the point where batteries use rare earth minerals, like there is no impact to the RAEs contention. Fundamentally, we outweigh at the point where like we have to resolve climate change, because these cancer areas would become the entire globe if we didn't control emissions. We tell you that there is a net good to actually utilizing these RAEs in the form of wave energy, because wave energy has zero emissions in terms of actual carbon. On the point about like waterways and resources, again, we're not using waterways, we're using wave power in coastal areas. Like, I feel like they just fundamentally misunderstand our plan, and they tried to read generics on dams when they have other generics to read. They read mangroves. But again, our plan isn't about waterways, so there's no link here. Now let's just do extensions. Extend how hydroelectric power is more efficient. This goes dropped. It's 90% more efficient, in fact, than other clean energy sources, which is uniquely why we need to invest in this. The more efficient an energy source is, just means like the more energy we can actually derive from it, which means like the faster we can solve for climate change. Then extend wave energy is good. Extend how wave energy tech contributes zero emissions. Extend how like wave energy tech is very promising, and that it like at the shore alone, it can produce 30 kilowatt hours to 40 kilowatt hours per meter of a wave across the shore. Extend how this is 20 to 60 times more energy dense than other forms of renewable energy. Extend consistency. Extend how like we get consistent energy generation through wave energy. Then extend how research and development is key. Extend how there's only 6 wave energy projects in total right now in the US, and that we need to develop more to actually get better clean energy. Extend how like this is less than 1% of energy generation right now in the US, but then also extend how investment could change this. Extend how like in the United States, wave energy is estimated to like be able to take on 64% of the US's total electric generation, and extend how the alternative is fossil fuels. This goes conceded by my opponents. They read generics as to how like our energy is bad, but like the alternative is fossil fuels, because they like completely drop this point at the point where you're having to compare like fossil fuels and actual carbon emissions to like getting wave energy from buoys. You probably vote AF. But on the links, extend like the wave power development links we read to you. This just goes conceded. This shows we have solvency. On the internal links, extend like reliance on fossil fuels. Again, this goes dropped. If you don't do the AF plan, we're more reliant on fossil fuels as a result, and that is the world of the neg at the point where they didn't run a counter plan. Then extend signaling. Extend how we can satisfy 20 to 30% of the global energy demand in the future by like boosting wave techs, like by boosting wave power generation technology, by signaling to other countries that this is good. Then extend the impact of like climate change. This fundamentally goes dropped, and extend how our plan solves, because again, 20 to 30% of global energy and 64% of the US's total energy being completely clean, zero emission sources would definitely offset warming. Extend how like this is an existential threat. Extend how 1 million species of animals and plants could die as a result of this. Extend how we need to act now, and we need to do the AF immediately before we reach like climate irreversibility. Now let's go on to the neg. Let's start on the first disad about like reliability and things like that. The overview to this disad is that we are not using we're not using reservoirs, we're not using dams. So the entire contention doesn't flow through. Let's go down the line by line. The first thing my opponents talk about is again methane generation. Cross apply how we're not using methane because this is like kinetic to potential energy generation. Like extend like basically everything we read to you as to how like we are not dams. On the point about how like you can't place this anywhere, this isn't fundamentally true with wave generation. Specifically, that is what we are defending. When they talk about how like we can't access our impacts because like wave energy isn't predictable or consistent. Cross apply how again it is. We're not using like reservoir generation. We're not using dams, which are like pretty inconsistent. We're using waves, which we can predict. And then just extend how there's like not much maintenance for waves, because again, there's like not much damage that happens to these buoys. So this is fundamentally way better, and nothing links in this contention. On the second contention about mangroves, at the point where current wave energy generation isn't being put in mangroves, there's no planned wave energy facilities in mangroves. It's likely that there won't be in the future. They just tell you that, oh, on the coastal areas, there's these like mangroves, but at the point where like those are protected areas anyways, there's just no link. When they say like we require a deforestation of mangroves, this fundamentally isn't true. We're already putting buoys in the ocean, and they don't even have to be in just like coastal shores. They can also be further out in the ocean, which we tell you actually generates more power. On the last disad about RAEs, just cross apply everything I already tell you. Like the entire contention is non-unique. This applies to literally all forms of energy, since again, batteries use RAEs. It's a good usage of RAEs anyways, and at the point where we're looking to space mining to solve for these shortages, this is already probably solved in the near future. So for all those reasons, since we think all of the offense is flowing AF, we strongly urge a vote there.
Okay, for a brief off-time roadmap, I'm just going to be going over a little bit of framing, and then I will be going to the affirmation case. I'll spend most of my time there, and with any remaining time, I'll return to the negative case. So with that, if anyone is not ready, let me know, and I will start my time on my first word. What the affirmation case boils down to is this idea that we need green energy, right? That's the reason that they want to implement their plan, and ultimately the reason why essentially they are affirming. But ultimately what you're going to see here is that hydroelectric power, whether looking at dams or wave energy generation, is not the answer. Ultimately, green energy is something that is necessary. We don't disagree on that. But what we have to recognize in today's debate is we are discussing what is essentially unique to hydroelectric power, right? And insofar as we see unique harms that really aren't worth its benefits, we are going to see a clear negation ballot. So next, let's just move on to topicality and just kind of the expectations that we have for today's debate. So again, the resolution is stating that the USFG should substantially increase investment in hydroelectric power. So yes, this doesn't necessarily specifically limit them to having to use or to only using dams, but recognize that it doesn't specify wave energy either. So when the resolution ultimately just addresses hydroelectric power as a whole, and even the definition provided by the affirmation recognizes that hydroelectric power is both wave energy generation and the use of like reservoirs and dams for hydroelectric power. Recognize that the reasonable expectation is that they're addressing hydroelectric power as a whole, as opposed to narrowing down on a single type of hydroelectric power. So ultimately what you're going to see here is that our impacts surrounding dams should be kind of taken into account in today's debate, as ultimately the reasonable expectation, both set by the definition of the affirmation and just the general wording of the resolution, should include that as well. So you can kind of extend those as they weren't really refuted. So if you buy this idea of kind of topicality, recognize that all of our impacts surrounding dams and reservoirs will flow through in today's debate. But even if you don't buy this, we're ultimately going to see that the harms of having wave energy generation is not worth kind of implementing it and increasing our reliance on that. So let's get into this. Let's get into the affirmation case. So their first contention, or really their only contention, sounds just on the efficiency and the benefits to having this type of energy. One response is ultimately all of their impacts really could be accessed with like any form of green energy. Really, the only uniqueness here is that wave energy like is more effective. But ultimately, what we're going to see here is the extent to which we have to implement this really isn't worth it. I'm going to get into this a little more later, but don't really buy their impacts as unique to hydroelectric energy, as really any form of green energy could kind of solve for the problem that they're presenting to you. So kind of recognize that uniqueness to their case, not at this moment. So next, moving just on to kind of rebuttals to this concept, right? So really their only contention is about we should implement hydroelectric power. They say it's more efficient, and they really just stop there. And then they go into how it essentially solves a bunch of issues. But again, it's not worth the cost. So let's kind of evaluate a couple of the reasons why this is the case. First, they describe that it's kind of 90% more like efficient, but they ultimately don't kind of like quantify that. They don't say how much how much infrastructure we would have to put into the ocean to actually achieve this efficiency, right? And so insofar as they don't really specify how much we actually need to create, how much how many buoys or how many whatever other infrastructure needs to go into this energy, how much we need to build in the ocean to do this, we don't really see them necessarily accessing this efficiency. Yes, the potential might be this great, but we don't actually see that being feasible, as not only do they not really specify like funding, but they don't specify how they would actually be, or to what extent they would actually be implementing this. So don't really buy this because the affirmation plan lacks specificity here. Next, we can look at this idea of just environmental harm, right? Ultimately, we see a couple things when it comes to this. First is, again, construction is intensive, whether it's buoys or any other infrastructure. Ultimately, we are putting metal, plastic, other materials into the ocean. We are constructing things in the ocean, ultimately having a couple impacts. Not only does it harm biodiversity in that we are disrupting the ecosystems that exist in those areas, but we are also just increasing the amount of waste that we are putting into these oceans. On top of this, they don't really describe the idea of maintenance. These things aren't going to just be pristine and helpful forever. So ultimately, when we either have to kind of abandon certain things because they either become dysfunctional or they just kind of require maintenance, again, this is going to just further disrupt these ecosystems. And again, that's not something that we should be doing. Ultimately, climate change is like a human-centric issue. But on top of this, we have to recognize that in our fight against climate change, we shouldn't be sacrificing the environment to do this, as that's largely counterproductive. And they don't really address this idea of environmental harm. Look at our contention 2 surrounding mangroves. Yes, even if you don't buy the fact that mangroves specifically will be harmed, the same reasoning can apply. Again, the waste, the destruction of environments is going to happen with the construction of wave energy generation. If you want a substantial impact from this form of energy, you are going to have to disrupt these ecosystems, which is not something we should be sacrificing in our fight against climate change. Next, we can turn to the idea of cost. Again, this kind of comes down to this lack of specificity in the affirmation plan. They don't really describe how much they're going to be spending on this. And really, because of this, we can't quantify the impacts they're going to achieve. Again, they describe the potential of wave energy generation, but they don't go into specifically how they're going to achieve this potential. And again, what we see here is two realities. One, they spend a lot of money putting into this infrastructure to have this type of energy. And again, that worsens the environmental harms. Or two, they don't create that much infrastructure surrounding this, and they don't really access much of the kind of green energy impacts that they are trying to sell to you. So what we see here is, again, because of this lack of specificity, we don't really see what they're actually going to be accessing in terms of impacts. But again, either reality has unique harms to wave energy generation. Next, on this idea of rare earth elements. Again, yes, any form of energy that uses batteries is going to use rare earth elements. But what's important to note here is that the storage of wave energy generation is very battery intensive. And what we're going to see here is that this is going to just increase our reliance and usage of rare earth elements, which isn't something we should be doing as a solution to climate change. As again, we describe the negative impacts of our reliance on that. Next, we can turn to this idea of uniqueness. Again, because they don't actually quantify how they are going to achieve the potential of the efficacy of wave energy generation, we don't see any uniqueness with this, but we do see uniqueness with the harms. Again, because of all of the infrastructure needed to have this type of energy, we are going to be creating unique harms on ocean ecosystems, ultimately having negative impacts. Next, we can turn to this idea of landlocked states. Again, if they are deciding to narrow their plan only to wave energy generations, this really won't help landlocked states in the United States. But if they want to help those states, they kind of have to access the use of reservoirs, which again, we have told you is extremely harmful. So this impact of national benefit really isn't going to be seen. And finally, we can turn to this idea of extending globally. A couple responses here. First of all, again, the idea of landlocked countries. This is not a feasible source of energy for every single country in the world. So if we as the United States want to influence other countries to use green energy, why do something that isn't accessible to everyone? On top of this, what we can see here is that these countries that can't access wave energy generation will likely still turn to hydroelectric power. If the United States is so influential and we are influencing people to use hydroelectric power, what are these landlocked states going to do? They're going to be turning to these reservoirs. And ultimately, there is where you see these impact of reservoirs. So if you we can buy their points on the influence on other countries, but recognize that not only does that worsen the negative impacts of wave energy generation, but because of just kind of influence in terms of hydroelectric power, for countries that can't do wave energy generation because of being landlocked, they're going to turn to these reservoirs, thus finding all of the negative impacts that those create. On top of this, again, other countries might not have the infrastructure or the funding to be able to do this. So again, why try and influence the world in a way that isn't accessible to everyone? Ultimately, if we want to have a global impact in terms of fighting the climate crisis, we have to have a solution that is not only accessible to everyone in the United States, but is accessible to everyone in the world. So insofar as we see unique harms to hydroelectric energy and not really any unique benefits, nor do we see the affirmation actually accessing any of these impacts due to their lack of specificity, we see a negation ballot. Thank you.
Okay, just for a brief off-time roadmap, I'm going to be going over voters. First is going to be framework, second costs, and then a world-to-world analysis. With that, I will start my time now. First thing to address in today's debate is the framework for today's debate. We placed a burden on the affirmative that they need to prove that they need to actually affirm the resolution in its entirety. So as per the wording of the resolution, it doesn't necessarily say a specific type of hydroelectric power. It just says investment in hydroelectric power. That means that they
Point
have
of order,
to
stop time. I think the specific burden of the affirmative that was outlined from the start of the PMC was that we have to have a model to do the res, not affirming all of the res, whatever that even means. I also don't think that point was brought up in the previous speeches anyways.
Within the first speech, the exact wording was actually that the affirmative is to adequately address the resolution and provide a means of significantly doing this. So that actually applies to that. And during the other speeches, we've extended that argument to why this is an issue of topicality. So with that, I'll leave that to judges' discretion and restart my time now. So
We'll
on
take
to this
that under
idea.
advisement.
Huh?
I said we'll take that under advisement. Go ahead.
Thank you. All right, so onto this idea of topicality again. When they're referring to like the resolution and how you have to increase in hydroelectric power in general, they can't just ignore the impacts of hydroelectric dams and reservoirs. They can't ignore those impacts and only say we're only going to do this as wave power because that's just unfair and it doesn't address the resolution in its entirety, and that's the burden of the affirmation to do so. And then also just into their plan text, they tell you that they want to increase wave energy generation. However, they don't really give you like a significant means of how they're going to do this, how much they're going to do this. This lack of specificity, Judge, this is their fatal flaw. You can't really access any of the impacts. You can't really evaluate the impacts because they don't tell you how much they're going to be able to do this, what kind of funding is going to allow for this, because they try to access the impacts of, oh, this is going to be able to generate energy for the whole nation. But even if you like drop topicality as a whole, we can still win on their unique harms. The affirmative world, if we pass their plans, they provide those unique harms. And because of those unique harms, it's not worth it to pass that plan. And it's also just going to create net harms while just pouring money into something that's not going to last. So that leads me to my next voter issue of costs. Even though green energy generation is important in the combat of climate change, we also need to evaluate the cost. We need to evaluate the ethical harms of this. And we also need to look at the fact that there are other alternatives and ways to do this without necessarily just pouring all of our money into investment in hydroelectric power. Again, construction is intensive. The metals used, transportation, all of that, it harms biodiversity, it disrupts ecosystems, it creates habitat fragmentation, and it just harms the ocean as a whole. So even if they're going to be talking about like the wave generation, they like to tell you that, oh, it's just like a couple of buoys in the ocean. No, these have batteries, these are generators, these are still going to disrupt the environment. And then they look to this idea of maintenance. They think that, oh, buoys don't really require maintenance. Yes, they do. They're in the ocean, they're going to need maintenance. They can't really access the impact of, oh, no, maintenance is not an issue. And while they're doing this, they disrupt the environment, but they also ignore the fact that it's not necessarily a renewable source of energy, right? Because rare earth elements are not renewable. Rare earth elements require mining. Rare earth elements mining cause human harms. And so just looking to this like world-to-world analysis, we can look to the fact that the storage of wave energy generation is battery intensive, and they create the unique harm by expediting this mining, by expediting this use of rare earth elements. They tell you that, well, if the United States does it, other nations are going to follow suit. If you buy that point, this also contributes to the opposition's unique harm that we point out in the affirmative, that even though rare earth elements are still used today in a lot of common sources of energy, they're going to be worsening this, and they're going to be using rare earth elements for a source of power.
I think the articulation of like signaling means that it exacerbates RAEs is like new. I don't think that specific link was brought up. I don't think it matters either way, so.
Okay, my response to that is that that was just an extension of my partner's response to your speech about how rare earth elements are going to continue to be used even more. So with that, I'll just leave it to the judges and restart my time. So when it comes to this world-to-world analysis, we just need to look at the fact that the affirmative can't really access their impacts. We can't really evaluate how much they're going to be able to solve climate change, but the one thing that we can evaluate is the unique harms that they create in doing so. They even say that, well, if we're going to be influencing like other nations to do this, we need to look at the fact that other nations in landlocked countries are going to be using these dams. So they also access these harms of having these dams and reservoirs. There's going to be droughts, it's unreliable, and they didn't really defend that at all. They didn't really tell you any reasons why like dams and reservoirs are okay, but they still do have to defend that. Their only argument to that was, well, we're only doing it on waves. But again, this is an issue of topicality, and they also have to access and defend those harms of this because their own case proves it so. Because there's landlocked areas, and by the United States influencing other countries to do it, they're going to be using these forms of hydroelectric power that aren't necessarily wave power. So because the affirmative can't address, didn't really address the unique harms that they create in these dams, and because it's not worth the cost of building these, we strongly oppose. Thank you.
Okay, cool. Order is just going to be probably just main points of clash. Oh wait, topic case, main points of clash, and then voters, and then world by world effect. Is everyone ready? All right. 5 minutes starts now. We strongly affirm the resolution. Starting on our case, you can basically just extend decreased reliance like on fossil fuels cleanly across the flow. It's clear that if wave power is 90% effective compared to like other forms of energy, we give you solar, which is only 36% efficient, wind, which is 25 to 45, and coal power is 33 to 40%. Clearly, if we're investing in something that could also generate 64% of the total US electricity that was like generated in 2021, this will massively decrease reliance on fossil fuels. All right, on to top of case. Basically, we're winning this to the point which you can cleanly extend our conceded definition of hydroelectric power. Wave power literally is a type of hydroelectric power. So substantially increasing investment is increasing investment in hydroelectric power. And they also just did not contest that definition. Thus, since the resolution is about hydroelectric power, and we say wave energy is a type of this, and they concede that, then we have the right to be like more specific in what we're advocating for. And the resolution, again, it never said anything about dams, so we have no burden to like defend these dams in a specific form of hydroelectric that we're not advocating for. And they also give like no implications to this, so there really isn't like a vote. This really isn't a voting issue in the first place. On specificity, one, you could have literally just POI'd us to like specify it and ask us to specify, but you didn't do that. So we would have like happily answered a POI and like specified or something, but you just like didn't even ask us in the first place. And then second, we cannot be expected to know exactly like the amount of funding or the exact implementation of our plan in 20 minutes. This is just a completely unreasonable burden, and that's just completely unfair to place that burden on the affirmation. Again, we like have 20 minutes of prep time. There's no reason to believe that we should have an exact plan with the amounts of funding and like the whole process worked out perfectly. That's just unreasonable. All right, on costs. Basically, there's just like no way that you actually vote on like a funding dissat out of the MO. They could have they could have asked us in the POI or brought it up in the LOC. Bringing up on the MO is like extremely unfair. This also would not cost that much money. It's just the development of kinetic to potential energy generation, and like this technology already kind of exists, but we're just improving on this by increasing like research and investment and like increasing the implementation of it. On infrastructure, you can extend how there's like very little infrastructure utilized. It's literally just buoys and a cord and a generator. Like that's literally all that it is. On the point about like landlocked states, I don't even I think like okay, yeah, on the point about landlocked states, like we can move energy. Like I don't really get the point here. We don't need dams to do this. On maintenance, you can see that it's just like literally buoys. You can just take it out of the ocean and like replace it. It's not massive like industrial technology. It's literally just you put a buoy in the water, and that requires very little maintenance. On waste in the ocean, we are literally just putting out buoys. That's already like there in other places in the ocean. And on mangroves, the negation basically concedes that there's no link to this at all, because again, this is simply not what we're doing, and this isn't how it's been done in the past, so there's no reason to believe that that will happen. On rare earth metals, you can just extend how it's non-unique. This applies to all energy generation. We need some sort of like green energy to offset climate. Just extend how it's just completely a try or die. And this is offset by the existential impacts of climate change. And they talk about how there's so many other like green alternatives to energy, but they don't fiat any of it, and they all like relink to rare earth metals. All right, they say that like also our impacts could be true for all of green energy, but there are a few key flaws here. One, they're advocating for the status quo, which has massive reliance on fossil fuels. Again, 60% of US energy is from fossil fuels, and this shows absolutely no signs of changing. Two, we're discussing like whether to affirm or reject a plan, whether the plan, which is green energy, will be beneficial. And then third, they like concede that we can solve for climate change because they conceded in their speeches that that green energy is good. On to voters. First is time frame. We're like infinitely ahead on this point because we solve as soon as possible. We tell you that it is necessary to solve for this in 7 years, because in 7 years climate change will be irreversible, and that means that we seal the fate of extinction of countless species, possibly even our own species. And basically we solve infinitely faster on this point. And again, like the 7 years point was just completely conceded, so we solve because our opponents are just doing like nothing about climate change. On magnitude, the environment literally affects everyone. We tell you 1 million species could go extinct, and the only side that has a possibility of solving is the government, because the negation is like advocating for the status quo and advocating for fossil fuels. On probability, the probability of the act solving is infinitely more because the neg has no advocacy, thus they go for the status quo. And at the end of the day, do you want to uphold the status quo where 60% of our energy is fossil fuels and we continue to destroy the environment, where we continue with our pattern of a 2.05 degree Fahrenheit increase? We tell you that the time to act is now, and we have to do something about climate change. We can extend how in 7 years climate change will be irreversible. possible. My opponents have absolutely no alternative to this, and it is a try or die to solve for the environment. If we even have a chance of solvency, which we also have a pretty high chance of this, then we need to do something now to fix climate change, and that is why the affirmation will win this debate. Thank you.
All right, good round.
Good round, and thank you to the judges.
Thanks, everyone. I think we are still disclosing this round, if I understand right. So we'll probably both just take a minute, review our notes, and then do that.
Yep.